Heart rate zones have been used by athletes and coaches for as long as we've had portable heart rate monitors. But are we at risk of becoming too obsessed with those numbers?
Yeah, well, it's time to take a fresh look at heart rate training zones. What are they, when to use them, and when they could actually be limiting our training progression.
Think we're being controversial, questioning whether heart rate zones even matter? Well, let me introduce Olav Aleksander Bu, coach of the two recent Ironman world champions, Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden. In a recent Coach's Corner, he had this response to Mark's questions on training zones.
Zones, should we stick to them religiously? So for example, you're out on an easy run, you start seeing your heart rate drift into zone 3. Should you bring that heart rate down? Should you start walking up the hills to make sure it stays in zone 2 and things like this? What would you suggest?
I would always look at it in the context of what's the purpose with the workout. So if it's like a very important workout which has the goal of preparing you for a race, or whether it's close to a race or far away from a race, I would rather allow for somebody to stick more to the target and not care so much about heart rate and these kind of things for that kind of workout. While if it's another workout that is more like a support workout for a workout that is going to prepare you, then I would maybe think that, okay, what is a consequence if I really push through on this workout now, leading into the next workout, which I know is important for you. And if you then think it, okay, if I push through here now, I'm uncertain, this might actually become a little bit so that I'm too fatigued into the important workout, I would ease off and just say, don't care about the zone. So zones, I would say I don't care too much about. I would rather stick more with what's the purpose of the workout and evaluate it in the context of whether it's in a workout where it's important to push through or actually ease off instead, yeah.
So it's like, again, a healthy balance with that. Okay, nice. Well, now we've dropped that curveball, let's rewind for a moment and revisit exactly what we mean by zones and how they came about in the first place before we go on to address some of Olav's points. Now, for the sake of this video, we're actually going to focus on heart rate zones today. Of course, there are power and pace zones, but because heart rate zones are used across all 3 sports within triathlon, we're going to use those for ease slightly. Now, on that note, your heart rate zones are not the same for all 3 sports, and that's because our max heart rate for each sport is different.
Yeah, well, talking of the different zones, they're usually broken into 5. 1 being super easy, 5 being the top end really hard. Now, in order to calculate them, you're going to need to do a threshold test, which is going to be hard, but it will be worth it in the long run because it'll mean you can make your training far more effective and efficient.
Yeah, now you've probably heard of the good old FTP test, the functional threshold power test used within cycling. Of course, this refers to power, but you can use heart rate and take your heart rate zones from this. Now, this is simply just a 20-minute all-out effort, and then you'll take your average heart rate from that, and then 95% off that. In the running world, we'd recommend doing a solo 30-minute all-out effort, and then take your average pace and heart rate from that. Or you could do a 5 or 10K race, should you like. And then in swimming, there's the critical swim speed test, CSS. This is a 400 meter and a 200 meter all-out effort. You can take your heart rate from that, although it's a little more tricky in swimming.
Once you have these stats, there are lots of online tools, like Mark mentioned, or an online training platform such as Training Peaks, which will actually simply do the maths for you, and it will give you your threshold heart rate and go one step further and even tell you your zones. And as a guide, your zones in percentage of your lactate threshold heart rate look like this. And why not take a screenshot so you've got the reference?
Now, there's no prizes for having a higher or lower lactate threshold heart rate. The whole reason we're using these percentages is to make it specific to you. It's not like VO2 max where we're striving to have the highest number possible. That said, your lactate threshold heart rate and your zones will change as your fitness does. So do make sure that you're testing on a regular basis to make sure it's accurate for you.
And if you want a bit of guidance away from the scientific element and maybe you work off of more of a perceived effort, well, to give you an idea of that scale, zone 1 would be very light, zone 2 would be light, and then when you get to zone 3, that's kind of moderate effort. Zone 4 is where the hard work happens, and finally, zone 5, well, you're right up into the red, working super hard then.
You will soon realise if and when you do a threshold test just how hard they are, and essentially anything above that is zone 5. Now you'll find a lot of coaches out there maybe even using more zones, some using less, and they might focus on things like threshold sessions, steady state efforts, and maybe just easy recovery sessions.
Yeah, well, that brings us on to when to use zones and why they can actually be really helpful. Well, if you're a coach and you're maybe coaching an athlete remotely, or you're coaching a group who are at different levels of ability, well, when you can prescribe intensity and effort using zones, it makes everything much more simple and more unified. And a tip here, if you use a smartwatch, then you should be able to actually, or a sports watch, you should be able to actually see your zones. If you set it up so it recognises your heart rate zones, you can then at a glance actually see what zone you're working in. It's often colour coordinated, and you can take that one step further. If you've got a session where you need to stay, say, in zone 2, you can set parameters, and it can actually, your watch can beep at you if you go above or below it.
Great. Well, let's now take a look at when you use what zones and the reasoning behind them.
Zone 1, this is super light and easy, and it's safe purely for those recovery sessions. It's just about getting your blood flowing, your muscles moving, and prepping you for the next bit of quality work.
Now zone 2 should feel light and should feel like you can keep going at that intensity for a long period of time. In fact, it's the sort of intensity that you will do probably a lot of your easier sessions at. And it's often referred to as the fat burning zone because your body is more easily able to utilize fat for fuel and the requirement for carbohydrate is less.
Zone 3, working in this zone is especially efficient at getting the heart pumping and the blood flowing from your heart to your skeletal muscles, and you can actually get a lot of bang for your buck in zone 3, but it's had a bad reputation in the past, and it's even been labelled as the grey zone, with athletes in theory spending too much time doing all of their training in one zone. But it can be overlooked as how useful this zone is, as it's not actually going to be putting as much stress on your body as a zone 4 workout. However, you're still getting a lot of physiological benefits.
The heart rate zone 4 is where the going gets tough. You're going to be breathing hard and yet still working mostly aerobically. This is the kind of intensity that's going to start helping to improve your speed endurance and also start to improve your ability to use carbohydrates for fuel and also start to withstand working at that kind of intensity.
And then zone 5, this is where you're working at maximal effort and you're not going to be spending very much time in this zone. But when you do want to train here, you've got to turn up mentally and physically ready to push really hard and be prepared to experience lactic, because it's going to build up pretty quickly and you're not going to be able to work in this zone for more than a couple of minutes at a time. And if you're training for a half Ironman or an Ironman, you're not really going to need to do very much in zone 5. However, if you're targeting a sprint or Olympic and you want to really nail that sprint finish, then it could be useful.
Now, you'd like to think that with everything being based on heart rate, that we can rely on this heart rate and zones irrespective of external factors. Unfortunately, this is not the case with heart rate. For example, climate, diet, adrenaline, fatigue, even dehydration levels can all affect our heart rate. So you want to bear this in mind when you are using heart rate and zones, and actually maybe factor in a little bit of leeway in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and then it becomes a bit limited when you're working at that top end. So if you're doing shorter or really sharp effort, so anything in zone 5, and even if you're doing zone 4 work, but for a short period of time, you'll find that your heart doesn't really start to actually show the signs of this harder work until you're halfway through the effort or you've even finished the effort.
Whereas it's these lower zones, particularly zone 2, that is probably more effective, making sure that you're staying in that aerobic zone and training the correct systems, which brings us back to Olav's point. The hard work should be really hard and the rest should support that.
Yeah, well, coaching really is an art, and Olav is a master of that art, but that isn't to say that heart rate can't help guide you. And when you're starting out and you're building up your training, it's a really good reference point, but it's a guide, not gospel. But I would love to know whether you train to heart rate or if you use zones, or whether you just simply look at your heart rate as an extra reference. Do let us know in the comments section below.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed today's video, please do give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and please support the channel. Give us a subscribe.